Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a place where the air is warm, the waves roll in with a sleepy rhythm, and palm trees sway as if time itself has decided to slow down. You're standing on the shores of Oahu, Hawaii, in the quiet hours before midnight, when the island's hum is nothing more than a soft blend of distant ukulele strings and the gentle hiss of the Pacific. It's hard to imagine that this tranquil night will be remembered as the calm before one of the most shocking mornings in modern history. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a single shift in this place, not because of any danger lurking in the shadows, but because the Hawaiian humidity would glue your shirt to your back faster than you can say tropical vacation. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our little sleepy history club scattered all around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1941. The night sky over Pearl Harbor is mostly clear, with just a scattering of stars. You shuffle along the darkened docks, your footsteps echoing against the wooden planks. The ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet rest silently in the harbor, like enormous beasts asleep in their pens. Battleships such as the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma float gently, their gray hulls barely glinting in the moonlight. To your right, a sailor leans against a railing, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. Somewhere, a radio plays a soft swing tune. It's almost too on the nose. You catch the scent of salt and engine oil, a strangely comforting combination. Life here has a predictable rhythm. Drills in the morning, maintenance through the afternoon, cards and jokes in the mess hall at night. Many of the sailors are asleep in their bunks right now, fanning themselves in the humid air. Others pull late-night watch duty, their minds wandering between home and the endless stretch of black ocean. You look up at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. From here, Pearl Harbor seems invincible, guarded by a geography, distance, and a quiet confidence. After all, this is U.S. territory. It's thousands of miles from any enemy shore. The notion of being attacked here feels almost absurd, like expecting a thunderstorm in a desert. But while the island sleeps, elsewhere in the world, tensions have been building like distant thunder. On the other side of the Pacific, leaders make plans that will soon shatter this calm. It's the kind of tension that hides under polite diplomatic phrases, trade negotiations, and newspaper headlines that most people skim over with their morning coffee. Back at the harbor, you pass a row of moored destroyers, their sleek shapes blending into the night. A guard yawns, leaning on his rifle. He nods at you, but doesn't say a word. Watch duty is dull, and that's how everyone likes it. The last thing anyone here expects is excitement. After all, in military terms, Pearl Harbor is considered a low-threat environment. There are some radar stations, a few reconnaissance planes, but nothing that would suggest imminent danger. Nearby, the officers' quarters are quiet, except for the buzz of ceiling fans. A few windows glow dimly as late-night paperwork is being finished. You imagine someone inside, sipping lukewarm coffee, trying not to fall asleep over a stack of reports. The paperwork probably includes mundane things like supply inventories, fuel requests, the sort of logistical background noise that keeps a giant naval base running. A quirky little fact that doesn't usually make it into the headlines: one of the most noticeable sounds at Pearl Harbor at night wasn't military at all. It was frogs. Thousands of them. Introduced to the island earlier in the century, their croaking was so consistent that locals joked you could tell the time by their chorus. Right now, their rhythmic song mingles with the sound of the waves, giving the night an oddly hypnotic quality. Historians still argue whether the tranquility here lulled commanders into a sense of invulnerability. Some suggest that the geographic isolation made Pearl Harbor's leadership underestimate the possibility of attack. Others argue it was a mix of intelligence gaps and old-fashioned overconfidence. Either way, as you walk along the dock, it's clear that no one here expects history to come knocking at dawn. You stop for a moment, leaning against a railing overlooking the water. The breeze carries the faint scent of plumeria flowers from somewhere inland. In the distance, lights from Honolulu twinkle like scattered fireflies. It's a postcard-perfect night. And somewhere far away, on the cold northern seas, another group of sailors moves through the darkness, with no music, no frogs in the night, and no cigarettes glowing. But for now, here at Pearl Harbor, you take a deep breath and let the slow rhythm of the island lull you. The stage is set, the players are in place, the audience, that's you, doesn't yet know the script. You lean on the railing for another moment, breathing in the soft Hawaiian air, and it's almost impossible to imagine the distant rumble that's building across the ocean. But if you shift your gaze eastward, figuratively at least, you find yourself in a world where the mood couldn't be more different. Across the vast Pacific, the diplomatic atmosphere between the United States and the Empire of Japan has grown thick with unease. It's the kind of tension that doesn't burst all at once, but rather builds, like steam trapped inside a kettle with someone holding the lid down. You probably wouldn't last a single afternoon in those diplomatic meetings. Too many polite smiles hiding too many clenched jaws. It begins with economics. Japan, eager to sustain its expansion across East Asia, relies heavily on imports, especially oil and steel. The United States, watching Japan's territorial ambitions with growing alarm, responds with sanctions and embargoes. At first, these are mild, annoying, like mosquitoes at sunset, but by mid-1941, Washington tightens the screws, freezing Japanese assets and cutting off vital oil supplies. Suddenly, those mosquitoes have turned into a full-blown swarm. In Tokyo, this is more than inconvenient, it's existential. The Japanese military machine runs on imported fuel, and without it, expansion slows, planes stay grounded, and ships remain docked. You can almost hear the impatient tapping of military boots echoing through government hallways. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his advisors debate how to handle the situation. Some push for diplomacy, hoping Japan will back down if presented with firm but reasonable demands. Others argue that Japan's ambitions can only be stopped with decisive force. Historians still argue whether the U.S. government underestimated Tokyo's willingness to go to war, or whether they assumed any attack would happen somewhere closer to the Philippines or Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. You can picture the scene. Officials sitting in dimly lit rooms, smoke curling from their cigarettes as maps are unrolled in territories circled in pencil. On the surface, everyone is being diplomatic, but underneath, calculations are being made. Japan is boxed in economically, America is wary of being drawn into a faraway conflict, and both sides are waiting for the other to blink first. At the same time, the Japanese military is gaining more influence in Tokyo. Civilian politicians may wear the suits, but the men in uniform are the ones steering the ship. Over the past decade, Japan has embarked on an ambitious program of expansion. Manchuria, China, and beyond. It has been successful, but also costly. The military believes the only way forward is to secure resources fast, and by force if necessary. To them, negotiations are like theater, polite, low-staged, but ultimately irrelevant once the curtain falls. A quirky tidbit here. In 1941, Japanese newspapers often published horoscope-like forecasts about the national destiny of the empire, and many of them talked about rising fortunes and storms on the horizon. Citizens would read these next to articles about trade disputes and military maneuvers. It gave the entire situation an almost scripted feel, as if history had already written the next act, and everyone was just reading their lines. Meanwhile, the U.S. public is largely focused elsewhere. Europe is in flames, with Britain struggling against Nazi Germany. Many Americans don't want to get dragged into another overseas war.
Memories of World War I are still fresh, like a scar that aches when the weather turns. Most citizens have only a vague idea of where Pearl Harbor even is. Some couldn't find it on a map if you offered them a free soda. In Japan, military planners begin to discuss what seems unthinkable: a preemptive strike on the United States. If they can disable the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one sudden blow, they reason, then Japan will have months, maybe even years, to secure the territories and resources it needs in Southeast Asia before the U.S. can recover. It's a gamble, but one they believe might just work if everything aligns perfectly. There's a strange duality at play. Across the Pacific, diplomats exchange carefully worded messages, while in military circles, maps are being marked with red arrows. The American embargo is both an economic chokehold and a psychological trigger. Japanese leaders see it as proof that the U.S. intends to block their expansion permanently. For them, war seems less like a choice and more like an inevitability dressed in formal language. You walk mentally through the halls of both governments. On one side, the quiet murmurs of negotiation; on the other, the sound of naval drills, steel being hammered, engines revving for practice runs. The kettle is starting to rattle. No one has lifted the lid yet, but you can feel the pressure. And here's a debate that still hasn't been fully settled. Did Japan truly believe it could win a long war against the United States? Or was it simply hoping to win quickly enough that America would accept a negotiated peace? Some historians argue that Tokyo underestimated U.S. industrial might. Others think they understood it perfectly but were banking on American hesitation. It's one of those strategic gambles that, in hindsight, feels like a slow-motion car crash you can't look away from. Back on the docks of Pearl Harbor, remember that peaceful night with the frogs and the swing music? None of this political chess game is visible. The sailors sleeping in their bunks aren't thinking about oil embargoes or imperial strategy. They're dreaming about home, sweethearts, or maybe just a decent breakfast. The Pacific may be wide, but the gap between intentions and understanding is even wider, and it's narrowing by the day.
Now, imagine yourself slipping quietly into a small, smoke-filled room in Tokyo, far removed from the salty air of Hawaii. The walls here are thick, meant to keep sound in and prying ears out. Maps are spread across long wooden tables. Men in crisp military uniforms lean over them, their fingers tracing coastlines and flight paths. In this room, the future is being sketched not with poetry, but with pencils, compasses, and the quiet determination of people who believe the stakes are nothing less than national survival. By late 1941, the Japanese leadership has reached a crossroads. The diplomatic kettle we talked about earlier, it's about to whistle. The choice is clear: either yield to American pressure and scale back imperial ambitions, which politically is unthinkable, or strike first and strike hard. You probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in this room without sweating through your shirt. The atmosphere is that intense. At the center of this storm sits Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. He's not your typical firebrand warmonger. In fact, Yamamoto once studied at Harvard, traveled through the United States, and understood its industrial power better than most Japanese officers. He famously warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he feared, the U.S. would overwhelm them. Historians still argue whether his participation in the Pearl Harbor Plan was reluctant duty or strategic genius. Some say he felt compelled by political reality. Others believe he crafted the attack as a masterstroke to buy time. Yamamoto's idea is as bold as it is dangerous. Launch a surprise airstrike on Pearl Harbor to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before war is formally declared. It's like trying to knock over a giant in its sleep and hoping it doesn't get back up. To pull this off, timing, secrecy, and precision
have to align perfectly. Within the Japanese Navy, staff officers work feverishly to refine the plan. They analyze harbor layouts, anchorage positions, and the daily routines of American sailors. Reconnaissance information is gathered through various channels, including, amusingly, Japanese students and tourists in Hawaii sending home observations about ship placements, disguised as casual letters. Imagine writing to your family, "The weather's lovely. By the way, the aircraft carriers usually leave on Fridays." A quirky little detail that modern intelligence agencies would frown upon, but back then, it blended into the everyday chatter. The plan evolves quickly. 6 aircraft carriers will form the core of the attack force, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Over 350 aircraft will be launched in 2 waves. The primary targets? American battleships, aircraft, and key facilities. Knock out the Pacific Fleet in one stroke, and Japan can seize Southeast Asia's resources without fear of immediate counterattack. It's audacious, almost theatrical in its ambition. Meanwhile, on the political side, Japan continues negotiating with the U.S. even as preparations for the attack accelerate. This dual-track strategy, talk peace while planning war, creates an eerie dissonance. Diplomatic cables still flow, meetings still happen, and polite language fills the air. But behind closed doors, the military is operating on a completely different timeline. You can picture one of these meetings, diplomats in formal suits exchanging carefully crafted phrases, while miles away at naval bases, mechanics tighten bolts on torpedoes specially modified to run in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Yes, that's the quirky tidbit here. Standard aerial torpedoes would have sunk into the mud. Japanese engineers solved this by adding wooden fins to make them glide more shallowly. Innovative, if a bit terrifying. Another factor that makes the plan both brilliant and risky: distance. Pearl Harbor is about 3,400 miles from Japan. For the strike force to reach its target undetected, it must sail through frigid northern waters, maintain strict radio silence, and rely on precise navigation. If they're spotted early, the entire operation collapses. It's like sneaking up on someone across a football field without making a sound. Here's where historical debate gets lively. Some scholars argue that Yamamoto's plan was inherently flawed, too ambitious, relying on surprise as a crutch. Others claim it was a tactical masterpiece, undone only by larger strategic realities. And then there are those who point out that even if the attack had gone perfectly, it might have only delayed the U.S. response. The discussion continues, often as passionately as the planning once did in that Tokyo room. In the meantime, the Japanese High Command locks down secrecy with almost obsessive precision. Very few people know the full details. Crews selected for the operation are quietly transferred to new units without being told where they're headed. Training intensifies in remote bays and icy waters. Radio operators go silent. The operation receives a simple, innocuous name: Operation Z. In one of those slightly surreal moments of history, while these plans are being refined, Japanese diplomats in Washington are still meeting with American officials to discuss peace terms. You can imagine the awkwardness, like someone smiling politely at you while hiding a slingshot behind their back. The United States continues to demand Japan withdraw from China. Japan continues to insist that's unacceptable. Neither side knows they're just days away from crossing a line that can't be uncrossed. As the final plans are approved, a sense of inevitability fills the air in Tokyo. The military believes this strike is their only chance to level the playing field before war engulfs the Pacific. Politicians nod along, some reluctantly, some with fervor. Yamamoto, ever the strategist, understands the risks. But he also knows the machinery of war is in motion. Once started, it won't stop. You step back from that smoke-filled room, the maps and models burned into your mind. The pieces are being set on the board. In Hawaii, the frogs still sing. In Tokyo, the pencils keep scratching. And somewhere in between, a fleet is about to move.
If you step out of that cramped Tokyo conference room and follow the echoes of Yamamoto's plan across the cold northern Pacific, you'll find yourself standing on the deck of a massive carrier in late November 1941. It's dark. The air is sharp and icy, stinging your cheeks. The ocean up here isn't the warm, lazy swell of Hawaii. It's steel gray, restless, and cold enough to make your breath visible in the air. One by one, the ships of the Kido Butai, the Japanese strike force, begin to assemble. There's no grand ceremony, no fireworks, just ships sliding into position like chess pieces, silently, deliberately. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and a host of submarines and supply vessels. It's a floating armada designed not for a prolonged campaign, but for a single devastating blow. Orders are whispered, lights are dimmed, and for many sailors, their destination is still a mystery. They've been told they're part of a top-secret operation. They train relentlessly, launching planes, recovering them, drilling in cold winds until their hands ache. You imagine being one of them, standing on deck as snow flurries drift down, wondering what in the world could require this level of secrecy. Back in Japan, official news outlets give no hint of what's happening. Daily life goes on. Markets open, children go to school, people read the paper over rice and miso soup. Even most government officials don't know the true nature of the operation. Secrecy is so strict that the fleet's departure point, Hidokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, has been essentially cut off from outside communication. A quirky but telling detail. Before the fleet departed, every sailor had to mail their last letters home, all postmarked from a completely different location to maintain the illusion that they were still docked elsewhere. Imagine sending a cheery note to your family while knowing you might not be coming back. Weather's cold, food's fine, see you soon, with no return address that gives away your path. On November 26, 1941, the fleet slips its moorings under the cover of darkness and heads into the vast Pacific. No radio transmissions are allowed. Messages are carried by flag or signal lamp. Every precaution is taken to avoid detection. They head north first, into the frigid emptiness to avoid the usual shipping lanes. The idea is simple but daring. Approach Hawaii from the least expected direction, the empty, storm-tossed north where no one will be watching. Meanwhile, back at Pearl Harbor, life continues in a relaxed rhythm. Officers make weekend plans. Some soldiers complain about the mess hall coffee. Radar stations are newly installed, but not fully trusted. You could almost hear the collective shrug. Who's going to attack us here? The distance between these two worlds, the stealthy armada and the dozing base, shrinks with every nautical mile. On board the carriers, pilots are briefed in small groups. They're shown detailed models of Pearl Harbor, meticulously constructed mock-ups, complete with battleship row and airfields. They memorize flight paths, timing, and target priorities. Many are young, barely in their 20s, confident and eager. To them, this isn't madness, it's destiny. The Empire has chosen them to strike the first blow. Some probably still smell faintly of hair tonic and excitement. The logistics are staggering. Each aircraft must be fueled, armed, and launched in sequence to arrive over Pearl Harbor in tightly choreographed waves. Torpedo bombers will skim low across the water, dive bombers will aim for ships and hangars,
and fighters will strafe airfields to keep American planes grounded. The entire operation depends on perfect timing, down to the minute. Historians still argue whether this level of precision was realistic given the era's technology, or whether the Japanese were simply counting on luck, wrapped in discipline. Yamamoto, back on the mainland, stays in contact through heavily encoded transmissions, sent only at critical moments. His greatest fear isn't failure in the attack itself, but early detection. If the U.S. spots the fleet too soon, the carriers would have to turn back, wasting months of preparation and leaving Japan exposed. Every sailor, every pilot, every officer knows that radio silence isn't just a rule, it's survival. As the fleet advances, the Pacific turns harsher. Waves slam against hulls. Aircraft on deck are lashed down tight, their wings covered against the salt spray. Crews rehearse in the cold night, their breath steaming as they go through final checks. The quiet intensity on board is like the hush before a conductor's baton drops. Meanwhile, a few American intelligence officers in Washington and Honolulu are beginning to notice strange patterns. Diplomatic cables between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in D.C. are being sent more frequently, with encrypted sections increasing. Some radar blips and radio intercepts hint at unusual activity, but nothing clearly points towards Hawaii. Most analysts assume Japan will strike in Southeast Asia, perhaps against British Malaya or the Philippines. Pearl Harbor seems too far, too fortified, too unlikely. This is one of those moments where hindsight is a cruel teacher. With the pieces we have now, the path looks obvious. But in late 1941, the signals were scattered, buried under routine reports and human assumptions. Historians still debate whether the U.S. should have known or whether the fog of war simply did its job. On the Japanese carriers, night after night, the crews drill in silence. Sailors play cards in tight quarters, swapping rumors. We're going south. We're attacking Russia. It's a training exercise. No one knows for sure, except a few officers who keep their faces carefully blank. Above, the stars stretch endlessly. The fleet cuts through the water like a shadow. No lights, no radios, just the cold wind and the relentless churn of propellers. Each mile brings them closer to an island that has no idea what's coming.
Back in Hawaii, the air feels different. Not in a dramatic movie trailer way, more in the early morning when nothing seems out of place kind of way. It's now the days leading up to December 7th, 1941, and you wander through Pearl Harbor like a quiet observer, watching a world that's about to shift without knowing it. The naval base hums with its usual predictable rhythm. Sailors paint decks, clean rifles, and grumble about food. Officers file papers and argue about logistics that have nothing to do with war. A handful of men are on watch, scanning the horizon out of routine rather than expectation. You pass groups of soldiers laughing at jokes that will be forgotten in minutes, not realizing they'll remember this weekend for the rest of their lives. The weather is warm, the sky clear. Palm trees cast long shadows on the ground as the sun rises lazily. You catch the faint smell of fried eggs and coffee drifting from the mess halls. It's Sunday, a day of rest, and the base runs at half speed. For many, it's a day to sleep in, write letters home, or take the bus into Honolulu to meet friends. It's the kind of morning where nothing bad is supposed to happen. Sailors lounge on decks in undershirts, some tossing baseballs, others reading newspapers. A few lean against railings, staring across the still harbor waters at the long line of battleships. Battleship Row is calm and almost picturesque. The USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, and others moored neatly in a row, reflecting in the water like gray statues. Their crews aren't on high alert. There's no expectation of trouble. The idea that an attack could come here on a Sunday morning in the middle of the Pacific is so far-fetched it might as well be a punchline. A quirky little detail. The night before the attack, many officers had attended parties and dances in Honolulu. A swing band played late into the evening. Some sailors stayed up drinking, others fell asleep, still wearing their uniforms. The base wasn't in war mode, it was in weekend mode, and that made all the difference. Meanwhile, radar operators at a station on Oahu are going through the motions. The radar system is new, barely installed, still in its teething phase. The operators are young, undertrained, and accustomed to seeing false signals caused by everything from flocks of birds to atmospheric quirks. Historians still argue whether, even with perfect training, those early warnings could have been recognized for what they were. The radar blips that would later appear might as well have been fireflies in the night. On the airfields, rows of American aircraft sit parked wingtip to wingtip, a decision made for easier guarding against sabotage, not aerial assault. It's an understandable choice if you think of enemies as spies sneaking in at night, not waves of planes screaming down from the sky. The runways are quiet, save for the occasional maintenance crew tinkering with engines. You stroll past barracks where sailors are still asleep, someone snoring loudly through an open window. A radio hums faintly with swing music. Outside, a few officers are chatting about football scores, promotions, and weekend leave. There's a sense of complete normalcy, almost as if history itself has decided to give everyone one last quiet morning. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away to the north, the Japanese strike force is cutting through the waves in total silence. Their decks are cleared. Aircraft are armed and fueled. Pilots review final orders under red lantern light. The operation is now in its final approach. Every mile they cover narrows the gap between two worlds, the sleepy base and the approaching storm. Here's a fringe tidbit not many people know. At around 3 a.m. Hawaiian time, a small Japanese submarine actually attempted to sneak into Pearl Harbor. It was spotted and attacked by a U.S. destroyer. A brief skirmish took place, but in the confusion, the event wasn't immediately escalated. Some officers assumed it was an isolated incident or even a training exercise gone wrong. That little submarine encounter would later be recognized as the first shots of the Pacific War, hours before the planes arrived. Historians still debate whether the warnings from that submarine incident, combined with intercepted intelligence and radar blips, could have prevented the devastation. Some argue that complacency was simply too deep. Others point out that multiple small signals scattered across different departments were never pieced together into a coherent threat picture. Pearl Harbor wasn't blind, it was distracted. You keep wandering. The breeze carries the faint scent of flowers from inland gardens. The distant sound of a church bell echoes through the air. Sunday service is starting soon. Some sailors will attend, others will sleep through it. A group of pilots from the U.S. Army Air Corps are joking near their planes, not realizing that in a few hours, those aircraft will be targeted before they can even take off. It's strange to think how quiet the harbor feels. There's a stillness to it like a held breath. You pass by the USS Arizona. A few sailors lean lazily on the rail, chatting. They don't know that within hours, the Arizona will become the most iconic symbol of the attack, torn apart in one single catastrophic explosion. Somewhere far to the north, on the Japanese flagship Akagi, the signal is given: climb Mount Niitaka. This coded phrase confirms what everyone on board has been training for. War is imminent. Planes will launch in just a few hours. The pilots are eating their final pre-mission meals. Some are nervous, others excited. Many write final letters that will be mailed only if they don't return. Back in Hawaii, the frogs are still croaking, the coffee still brewing, and the sailors still laughing. The distance between routine and catastrophe has narrowed to mere hours. And if you're standing there on that dock looking out at the peaceful harbor, you wouldn't see anything unusual. But if you listen carefully, past the music, past the chatter, you might sense it, a faint, approaching hum just beyond the horizon.
The sun hasn't fully climbed over the mountains yet. It's that soft, half-light moment when the world feels suspended between night and day. The breeze over Pearl Harbor is gentle, warm, and utterly indifferent to what's about to happen.
You're standing on the dock, taking in the smell of salt and coffee, when, somewhere far to the north, the first engines roar to life on the decks of 6 Japanese carriers. On board the Akagi, the flagship, pilots file onto the flight deck. Their faces are mostly calm, some stoic, some quietly exhilarated. The wind whips across their flight suits as mechanics pull away chocks and give thumbs up. Planes line up like arrows on a bowstring, ready to be released. The first wave of the attack is about to begin. 183 aircraft in total, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters, launching into the cold morning sky. The sound builds slowly, like a storm forming far away. One by one, aircraft rumble down the deck and leap into the air. Torpedo bombers skim the waves, dive bombers climb steadily, and fighters form protective screens. Within minutes, the sky above the fleet is alive with movement, then suddenly empty again as the planes disappear toward the south. The ocean swallows the noise, leaving the carriers in eerie silence. It's 6 a.m. Hawaiian time. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, the base is still asleep in every meaningful sense. The radar station at Opana Point is manned by 2 young soldiers, barely awake, drinking weak coffee and idly watching the green screen. At 7:02 a.m., they notice something unusual, a large formation of blips, larger than anything they've seen before, approaching from the north. One of them looks closer, frowns, then calls it in. The operator at the information center dismisses it as incoming American B-17 bombers expected from the mainland. "Don't worry about it," he says. "They're friendly." Historians still argue whether that single moment could have changed everything. Up in the air, the Japanese formation flies low and tight, skimming over the ocean to avoid detection. Pilots check their watches, adjust their goggles, and glance at one another through the morning mist. The operation depends on precise timing, hit just after dawn when American defenses are at their sleepiest, and chaos will do the rest. Back on the base, Sunday routines continue lazily. Some sailors are still in their bunks. Others gather near the harbor to watch the sunrise. A few radar operators are off duty, convinced nothing interesting will happen. Soldiers are starting breakfast. A church bell rings softly in the distance. It's a moment so peaceful, it almost dares you to believe it will last. At 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, the silence breaks. From the north, faint at first, you hear the low rumble of engines. It sounds like distant thunder or a swarm of bees. You look up. Tiny specks appear on the horizon, growing larger by the second. The first wave has arrived. The pilots break formation as they approach Oahu, splitting into groups to hit their designated targets. Dive bombers peel off toward airfields like Hickam and Wheeler, while torpedo bombers line up along the harbor to attack the anchored battleships. High-altitude bombers begin their runs, aiming for ships clustered together like sitting ducks. One quirky but chilling detail: several American soldiers on the ground initially mistake the approaching planes for a scheduled exercise. One even jokes about it. After all, who expects an actual enemy attack on a sleepy Sunday morning in paradise? Seconds later, reality shatters. The first bombs fall on Wheeler Airfield, exploding in a rapid chain that rips through rows of parked aircraft. Hangars burst into flames. The sound rolls across the island like a massive drumbeat. At almost the same time, torpedo bombers skim just above the water of Pearl Harbor, releasing their modified torpedoes toward Battleship Row. The sleek metal shapes slice through the harbor surface like sharks. Moments later, they strike home. The USS Oklahoma takes multiple hits and begins to list dangerously. The USS West Virginia is slammed by torpedoes, water flooding in. Sailors scramble half-dressed, some barefoot, stumbling out of bunks into a scene that makes no sense at first. Smoke, fire, shouting, explosions echoing between steel hulls. The USS Arizona, still quiet and majestic just moments earlier, becomes a target for high-altitude bombers.
One bomb pierces her forward magazines at 8:06 a.m., detonating more than 1,000,000 pounds of gunpowder in a single instant. The explosion is so massive, it lifts the ship out of the water, splitting her hull. A huge fireball erupts, visible from miles. In less than 9 minutes, the Arizona is gone, taking over 1,000 men with her. You can imagine the sensory overload, the roar of engines overhead, the boom of bombs, the metallic scream of tearing steel, the cries of sailors who seconds earlier were still half asleep. The smell of burning oil fills the air, thick and choking. Black smoke billows upward, staining the clear blue sky. And yet, amid the chaos, some defenders react with remarkable speed. Gunners scramble to man anti-aircraft weapons, many still in their underwear. Pilots sprint to their planes, dodging shrapnel. A few American fighters manage to get airborne, engaging Japanese planes in desperate dogfights over Oahu. It's messy, improvised, and heroic. Historians still debate whether the Japanese achieved complete surprise or if fragmented intelligence could have provided a last-minute defense. Some argue the warnings were too subtle, too scattered. Others believe a different mindset at the top could have changed the outcome. What's clear is that in less than 10 minutes, the quiet harbor has become a battlefield. And this is only the first wave.
The first wave has barely passed when the air above Pearl Harbor starts to hum again, not with silence returning, but with the approach of the second wave. It's just after 8:30 a.m. Hawaiian time. The harbor is already a scene of flames and confusion, but the attack isn't over. Far to the north, the carriers have launched 171 additional aircraft. They streak through the sky, sunlight glinting off their wings, heading toward a base that's now fully awake but completely disoriented. You look up. The distant specks on the horizon grow larger, sharper. This time, American gunners are ready, or at least as ready as they can be under the circumstances. Anti-aircraft guns that were silent minutes earlier now thunder skyward. Smoke from burning ships and airfields curls upward like a dark curtain, partially obscuring the sky. The Japanese pilots dive straight into it, guided by meticulous planning and instinct. The second wave focuses on mopping up, destroying remaining aircraft, hitting secondary targets, and ensuring that anything capable of retaliating is neutralized. Dive bombers scream down on Hickam Field, targeting hangars, fuel depots, and repair facilities. Fighters rake the ground with machine gun fire. At Pearl Harbor, more torpedoes and bombs strike ships that are still afloat. USS Nevada, despite taking hits, tries to make a break for the open sea, engines roaring as she moves down the channel. For a brief, almost cinematic moment, it looks like she might escape. She doesn't. Bombers spot her and attack relentlessly. One bomb hits near her bow, causing massive flooding. Realizing she might sink in the channel and block the harbor entirely, her captain makes a split-second decision: beach the ship deliberately. The Nevada runs aground in shallow water, smoking, but still defiant, a gesture of resilience in the chaos. On the USS California, crewmen desperately try to keep the ship afloat by counter-flooding compartments. On USS Maryland, gunners blaze away at incoming aircraft, claiming several kills despite the confusion. The harbor echoes with a constant layered roar: bombs, gunfire, engines, shouting, and the deep crackle of burning fuel. The once still waters now churn with oil slicks, debris, and the bodies of ships and men. A quirky but human moment stands out. In the middle of all this, some sailors at Ford Island reportedly mistook incoming Japanese planes for American just for a second longer, because of the rising sun insignia looking at a distance like a decorative red circle. It's the kind of tragic misrecognition that belongs more to sleepy mornings than battlefields. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, the attack is running almost like clockwork. Pilots follow their flight paths, hitting predetermined targets. A few encounter resistance. American fighters have managed to get airborne from Hickam and Wheeler fields, engaging in frantic dogfights. For some of these pilots, it's their first and last combat mission. Historians still argue whether Japan should have launched a third wave, targeting vital infrastructure like fuel depots, dry docks, and submarine bases.
Many military analysts later concluded that skipping this step was a strategic error. Those untouched facilities allowed the U.S. Navy to recover far more quickly than expected. But at the time, Japanese commanders judged that staying longer risked losing too many aircraft to an increasingly alert defense. They opted to pull back after the second wave. Back on the ground, the human stories are unfolding rapidly. A nurse at the base hospital calmly directs triage efforts as waves of injured sailors pour in. Firefighters work shoulder to shoulder with soldiers to contain infernos on burning ships. Some men leap into oil-covered waters to save comrades trapped below decks, swimming through smoke and debris. Others climb into gun turrets, firing almost blindly at the sky. The USS Arizona, which exploded during the first wave, continues to burn fiercely. The fire is so intense that it will burn for 2 full days. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma has capsized completely, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. Rescue teams scramble across her overturned hull, tapping on steel, listening for survivors' knocks. Overhead, Japanese planes swoop in low for strafing runs, bullets kicking up plumes of water near shore installations. Anti-aircraft fire intensifies, though much of it is still poorly coordinated. The defenders are learning on the fly, literally. One particularly debated moment involves the aircraft carriers. None of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's 3 carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, are in the harbor that morning. They're at sea on exercises or ferrying aircraft. Historians still argue whether this was luck, foresight, or coincidence. Whatever the case, their absence will shape the Pacific War dramatically. These carriers will form the backbone of America's counterattack in the months to come. By 9:30 a.m., the second wave begins to withdraw. The Japanese pilots regroup, turning north to head back to their carriers. They've inflicted devastating damage. 8 battleships hit, nearly 100 aircraft destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans killed. But their own losses are relatively light. Fewer than 20 planes shot down. The strike has achieved its tactical goals, crippling the fleet, shocking the United States, but the strategic outcome remains to be seen. As the last planes disappear into the haze, a strange, almost unbearable quiet falls over Pearl Harbor. Smoke hangs thick in the air, fires rage on ships and airfields. The water is slick with oil, reflecting the flames like a distorted mirror. The sound of anti-aircraft guns fades, replaced by distant sirens, shouted orders, and the crackle of burning metal. You stand there, on the dock, where just hours earlier sailors lounged with their coffee. Now, the same spot is littered with debris and shell casings. The air tastes of salt, ash, and fuel. The sun climbs higher, illuminating a harbor that looks nothing like it did at dawn. The attack is over, but the consequences have only just begun.
The sky over Pearl Harbor has finally gone quiet, but the silence is thick, almost oppressive. Smoke drifts lazily upward, blurring the sun. You walk slowly through the base, and everywhere you look, the world has been turned inside out. Less than 2 hours ago, this was a sleepy Sunday morning. Now, it's a landscape of fire, oil, and stunned faces. Men stumble through the smoke, coughing, eyes wide. Some are barefoot, still wearing the clothes they slept in. Others are stripped to the waist, covered in grease, fuel, or blood. The once neat docks are littered with twisted metal, splintered wood, and abandoned equipment. A few sailors kneel by the water's edge, pulling survivors from the harbor. Others can do nothing but watch as oil slicks catch fire and burn across the surface like molten glass. You pass the USS Arizona, or what's left of her. Flames roar from the shattered deck. The massive superstructure has collapsed inward. The water around her churns with leaking oil, bubbling up in slow, hypnotic plumes. The smell is unforgettable, burning metal mixed with crude oil and salt. Even at a distance, the heat prickles your skin. It's hard to believe that just hours earlier, men on this ship were drinking coffee and cracking jokes.
On the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma, rescue teams have already begun their desperate work. Sailors with sledgehammers and welding torches scramble over the steel surface, tapping, listening for the faint knocks of trapped crewmen. The knocks come back, some steady, some fading. For the next 2 days, these sounds will echo through the harbor. Some men will be cut free, many won't. Historians still argue about how many lives might have been saved if equipment and trained teams had been on hand immediately. But Pearl Harbor was not prepared for a mass rescue effort like this. At Hickam Field, hangars burn. Aircraft that never left the ground lie shattered, their wings crumpled like paper. Pilots walk among the wreckage in disbelief, tracing fingers over bullet holes in planes that were supposed to be safe on home soil. A few still smell faintly of aviation fuel and the morning's breakfast, eggs and bacon mixed with smoke. The airfields, once symbols of modern aviation, now look like scrapyards. Inside the base hospital, the hallways are overflowing. Nurses and doctors work with quiet intensity, transforming corridors into makeshift triage zones. Wounded men lie on stretchers, floors, benches, anywhere there's space. Some are burned, others riddled with shrapnel, many simply in shock. A young nurse ties her hair back with shaking hands and moves to the next patient. A quirky, very human moment. One doctor reportedly grabbed a sailor's cigarette from his lips mid-surgery and puffed on it himself, muttering, "We're both going to need this." It's grim humor, but it's what keeps them moving. Outside, fire crews battle blazes that seem to have no end. Burning oil slicks smake across the harbor. Some men dive into the water to drag hoses under the flames, emerging singed but alive. Others climb onto still smoldering ships to rescue the wounded. It's not heroic in the Hollywood sense, it's messy, instinctive, exhausted bravery. Communication across the base is patchy at best. Phone lines are cut, radios damaged. Runners sprint between command posts carrying handwritten messages. Officers shout over the din, trying to make sense of conflicting reports. Was there an invasion fleet offshore? Were more waves coming? Were the carriers nearby? Nobody knows. In this fog of uncertainty, rumors bloom like wildfire. Here's a lesser-known tidbit. In the confusion, a few American gunners fired on friendly aircraft trying to land later that morning, mistaking them for a third wave. Several planes were damaged or destroyed, a grim reminder of how chaos can linger long after the shooting stops. Historians still argue about how to the extent the attack unified the American public in those first hours. Some point to diaries and letters that show shock turning almost instantly to resolve. Others highlight the deep confusion and fear. No one knew if more attacks were coming, if the West Coast was next, or how long this new war would last. What's clear is that in these hours after the attack, the United States changed not through speeches, but through the raw experience of vulnerability. By midday, fires continue to burn across the harbor. Tugboats move cautiously, spraying water onto smoking hulls. Hospital staff work without rest. Rescue operations intensify as more survivors are pulled from the wreckage. And slowly, command centers begin piecing together the scope of what's happened. The casualty lists grow. Messages are sent to Washington. Across the Pacific, the Japanese fleet turns north, undetected, disappearing into the vast ocean. You stand on a pier watching black smoke rise in twisting columns into the bright Hawaiian sky. The island still looks beautiful, but it's beauty through a veil of grief. The frogs are silent now. The swing music has stopped. All that remains is the heavy, slow rhythm of a harbor trying to understand what has just happened.
As the fires continue to smolder in Hawaii, the ripples from Pearl Harbor race outward faster than any aircraft could fly. You shift your gaze from the harbor to Washington, D.C., where it's already early afternoon on December 7, 1941. Telephones ring nonstop. Telegrams clatter in command rooms. Military aides sprint through corridors of power carrying urgent reports, their faces pale. Inside the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt receives the first detailed messages of the attack.
He listens carefully, his expression tightening. He's been in politics long enough to recognize a moment when history pivots. As the scope of the attack becomes clear, ships sunk, planes destroyed, casualties mounting, his mind is already turning toward the next steps. In the War Department, officers hunch over large maps of the Pacific, pinning colored markers onto key locations. They try to figure out where the Japanese carriers might be, whether another strike is coming, whether the Philippines or the West Coast is next. Confusion reigns at first. Early reports are contradictory. Some claim all battleships are sunk. Others say a counterattack is underway. The fog of war is thick, and yet the emotional clarity is unmistakable. America has been attacked. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, actually rode his horse that Sunday morning, a routine exercise he refused to skip before learning of the attack. By the time he arrived at his office, the damage was already done. It's one of those small, almost surreal images. While bombs fell in Hawaii, a top general was trotting through the crisp Washington air. Meanwhile, across the United States, news bulletins interrupt regular radio programming. People stop mid-conversation in diners, living rooms, and churches to listen. At first, some think it's a dramatic reading, a mistake, maybe even a hoax. But as more stations confirm it, reality settles in. A stunned hush spreads across the country, followed by a rising wave of anger, fear, and determination. In Honolulu itself, military and civilian authorities scramble to prepare for a possible invasion. Roadblocks are thrown up, beaches are fortified with barbed wire, blackouts are ordered at night. Rumors swirl, enemy paratroopers in the hills, submarines off the coast, saboteurs hiding in Honolulu. Most of these turn out to be false, but the sense of vulnerability is real and raw. Back in Washington, Roosevelt calls an emergency cabinet meeting. He leans on his cigarette holder, speaking in his usual calm and deliberate tone, but everyone in the room can feel the weight of the moment. By the end of the meeting, the decision is unanimous. The United States will declare war. There's no longer any political debate, no lingering hesitation. Pearl Harbor has unified the country in a way years of diplomacy never could. The next day, December 8th, Roosevelt addresses Congress. You can almost picture the packed chamber, senators, representatives, military officers, and journalists all crammed in, the air buzzing with tension. Roosevelt begins his speech with words that will echo through history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. His voice is steady, grave, and deliberate. As he lays out the facts of the attack, anger builds in the chamber like a rising tide. When he finishes, the applause is thunderous. Congress declares war on Japan within hours, with only a single dissenting vote. Historians still debate how inevitable this declaration was. Some argue that U.S.-Japan tensions made war unavoidable, and Pearl Harbor simply accelerated the timeline. Others believe that, without such a shocking attack, America might have stayed out of the war longer. Either way, the decision is swift, and the U.S. is now fully engaged in World War II. Around the world, reactions vary. In London, Winston Churchill hears the news and breathes a sigh of grim relief. Britain has been fighting alone against Germany for too long. Now the sleeping giant is awake. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler is reportedly pleased, but miscalculates terribly. 4 days later, he declares war on the U.S., sealing the fate of the Axis powers. In Tokyo, meanwhile, leaders celebrate the success of their Bering strike, unaware that they've set in motion a war they cannot sustain. Back in Honolulu, amid the ruins, military leadership begins immediate recovery operations. Divers are dispatched to assess damage below the harbor's surface. Tugboats clear debris. Aircraft are salvaged or scrapped. The surviving ships, some badly damaged, are towed to dry docks for repair. The USS Nevada, beached but intact, becomes a symbol of resilience. She will eventually return to fight again. Here's a lesser-known tidbit. Within hours of the attack, the FBI arrested hundreds of Japanese-American community leaders in Honolulu, fearing sabotage or espionage. Many were teachers, clergy, or business owners. Historians still argue about the necessity and morality of these actions, especially given the loyalty many Japanese Americans later demonstrated during the war. Across the continental U.S., the mood shifts almost overnight. Enlistment offices are swarmed by young men volunteering for service. Factories begin the slow transformation into wartime production powerhouses. School teachers talk about Pearl Harbor the next morning as if a distant neighbor had been attacked, except this time the neighbor is part of the same house. Roosevelt also signs orders for heightened military readiness along the West Coast. Anti-aircraft batteries are set up near cities. Civil defense drills become commonplace. Searchlights sweep the skies at night. Rumors of Japanese bombers reaching California circulate widely. None are true, but the fear is understandable. For many Americans, Pearl Harbor is not just a place on a map anymore. It's a wound. And wounds once felt tend to unite people in ways peacetime politics rarely can. You look back toward the Pacific, imagining the vast distance between Washington and Hawaii. That distance in a single morning has collapsed into a single story, an attack, a response, and a nation irrevocably changed. The fog of confusion may linger, but the direction is now clear. The United States is at war.
You take one last, slow walk through the harbor as the sun begins to set on December 7th, 1941. The water is still, except where tugboats churn through slicks of oil and debris. Fires continue to flicker on distant decks, crackling softly like campfires that refuse to die down. The chaos of the morning has given way to a heavy, stunned quiet. Everyone here seems to understand instinctively that this isn't just the end of a day, it's the beginning of a new world. In the days that follow, the long work of recovery begins. Divers descend into the murky, oil-filled waters to search for survivors and recover the dead. They move slowly, cautiously, through twisted metal corridors of sunken ships. The water is cold, dark, and thick with fuel. Some divers later recall that the oil was so dense it stuck to their skin for weeks. Their task is grim but essential: bring the harbor back to fighting shape. Salvage crews swarm the wreckage like determined ants. They patch hulls, pump out compartments, and clear debris. Some ships are beyond saving. The USS Arizona will remain where she fell, becoming a silent tomb for over 1,000 men. But others, astonishingly, will rise again. The USS West Virginia, sunk and battered, is eventually refloated, repaired, and sent back into combat. The USS Nevada, deliberately beached to avoid sinking in the Channel, will return to fight on D-Day. It's as if the fleet, knocked down hard, refuses to stay underwater. Here's a quirky, easily overlooked detail. In the weeks after the attack, sailors used long wooden poles to push burning oil slicks away from ships under repair, like firefighters herding flames across a lake. It's not glamorous, but it worked, and it shows how improvisation became as crucial as heroism. Meanwhile, investigations begin almost immediately. U.S. military leadership is under pressure to explain how such a devastating surprise attack was possible. Committees convene, officers are questioned, telegrams and radar reports are scrutinized. Historians still argue over the findings. Some say it was a failure of imagination, others a failure of communication. A few even whisper about conspiracy theories, but none hold up under real scrutiny. The simplest explanation remains the hardest to swallow. Complacency met cunning, and complacency lost. The people of Hawaii adjust quickly to life under martial law.
Curfews are imposed, blackouts become nightly rituals, and soldiers patrol the beaches. Civilians paint car headlights blue to avoid attracting bombers. Children carry gas masks to school. The island, once a postcard paradise, is now an armed fortress. There's a strange mixture of fear and determination in the air, like the quiet before a massive storm that everyone knows is still coming. Across the Pacific, Japan celebrates its victory, but uneasily. Admiral Yamamoto, the man behind the plan, reportedly remarks to a fellow officer, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Historians still debate whether he actually said these exact words, but the sentiment is real. Japan has won a stunning tactical victory, but strategically, they've struck a power with industrial capacity far beyond their own. The global impact is immediate and irreversible. The United States, previously divided over involvement in the war, unites almost overnight. Men line up to enlist, women flood into factories, offices, and military auxiliaries. Hollywood shifts from escapism to propaganda. American industry begins the massive transformation that will make it the arsenal of democracy. The attack on Pearl Harbor doesn't just draw the U.S. into the war, it turbocharges its war machine. Here's a lesser-known fact. In the weeks following the attack, a sense of hypervigilance sweeps the west coast of the United States. False alarms of Japanese planes trigger blackouts from Seattle to San Diego. One night in February 1942, anti-aircraft guns in Los Angeles even opened fire on what turned out to be nothing, an incident later dubbed the Battle of Los Angeles. It shows how deeply Pearl Harbor had burned itself into the national psyche. For the survivors, the scars, both physical and emotional, run deep. Many will spend years recounting their stories, some quietly, some publicly. Others will never speak of that morning again. Families receive telegrams with devastating news. Memorial services are held across the country. A sense of collective mourning takes hold. But it's laced with something else too: resolve. The attack, meant to paralyze, has instead galvanized. By early 1942, Pearl Harbor is already buzzing with renewed activity. New ships arrive, old ones are repaired, runways are cleared, and anti-aircraft defenses are upgraded dramatically. American carriers, spared during the attack, become the centerpiece of a new Pacific strategy. Within months, these same waters will launch ships and planes that turn the tide at places like Midway and Guadalcanal. As you look out over the harbor one last time, it's quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet you felt at the beginning of this story. That first quiet was innocence. This one is resolve. The water still shimmers in the fading light, reflecting not just the sunset, but the weight of everything that's happened here. Pearl Harbor began as a sleepy outpost on a Sunday morning. It ended the day as a symbol, a rallying cry that would echo through history. And now, as the stars begin to emerge over the Pacific, the world holds its breath for the long war that has just begun. The pace slows. The smoke of battle fades into a soft evening breeze. You let yourself step back, further and further, until the noise of engines and gunfire is nothing more than a distant memory. The harbor is still there, the ships resting in the water, the stars mirrored faintly on the dark surface. Take a long breath. Imagine the soft hum of night insects along the Hawaiian shoreline, the gentle slap of waves against the pier, the distant rustle of palm leaves.
The urgency of war gives way to the timeless rhythm of the ocean. History has unfolded, and now it simply is, resting quietly in the warm night air. You picture the people, sailors, nurses, families, drifting into uneasy sleep that first night after the attack. Some dream of home. Some stay awake under the stars, listening for the quiet for signs of danger that won't come. The frogs start to croak again, hesitantly at first, then steadily, as if the island itself is exhaling. The night doesn't erase what happened. It simply holds it gently, like waves holding the reflections of stars. Pearl Harbor will never be the same again, but neither will the world. And somewhere in that stillness, there's room to breathe. So close your eyes. Picture the harbor under starlight. Let the sound of the water carry you.